The beginning of a storm. The morning sun was a brilliant blaze, casting long shadows that stretched across the grounds of Pinehurst Academy. The grand white building loomed like an ancient fortress against the sky, its towering columns and pristine facade a symbol of tradition, exclusivity, and power. Today, the quiet hum of the school felt charged with an unsettling energy, as if the very air were waiting for something monumental to unfold. Maya and Milan Johnson, twins of just 15, sat in the back seat of their father's car, their hearts racing in tandem as they gazed up at the imposing school. Pinehurst Academy, the very place they had heard about their whole lives, but never imagined they would set foot in. It wasn't just any school. It was the epitome of prestige and success, where every student was expected to meet the high standards of an institution built on generations of privilege. And yet, here they were, two of the first black students to ever be admitted. "Do you feel it?" Maya whispered, her voice shaky. "Like we don't belong here." Milan didn't look at her sister, but Maya could feel the slight tension in her shoulders. She was the strong one, always the one to act tough, but Maya could tell her nerves were fraying too. Milan's mouth set into a firm line, her hands clutching her backpack with white knuckles. "We belong here," their father, Dr. Jordan Johnson, said, his deep voice steady and reassuring. He had a calm confidence that Maya and Milan had always relied on, especially when their own doubts crept in. "And you will show them why. Don't let anyone make you feel less than." Dr. Johnson turned off the car's engine and glanced at his daughters. His eyes, warm and proud, met theirs in the rearview mirror, conveying a quiet, unshakable trust in them. "Remember, this school is no better than the people who walk through its doors. And you are the best." Milan gave a slight nod, but Maya only managed a tight smile. It was hard to feel proud when the weight of history and prejudice was already bearing down on them. It felt like a mountain they had yet to climb. As they stepped out of the car, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. The crisp autumn air was cool, and their penny loafers clicked sharply against the concrete. The sound echoed in the silence of the sprawling campus, making everything feel even more surreal. The twins' uniforms, plaid skirts and blazers, made them stand out like two tiny, brightly colored birds among a sea of students in the same pressed khaki and navy blue outfits. "Let's go," Milan said, her voice resolute, though Maya could hear the edge of nervousness in her tone. They walked side by side, their steps synchronized, but each of them could feel the whispers and stares that followed them as they crossed the school grounds. The grand entrance of Pinehurst seemed to swallow them whole as they stepped through the doors, the chilly air inside the school feeling like a slap. The hallway stretched out before them, like a tunnel that seemed to grow darker with each step they took. Glass cases lined the walls, displaying academic awards, trophies, and photographs of past students, many of whom didn't look anything like the twins. There were no faces that resembled theirs. Not a single black face in any of the photographs of honor students, athletes, or class presidents. Maya felt the heavy weight of those stares. Some students quickly looked away, while others blatantly stared, their gazes filled with curiosity, suspicion, or something worse. It was clear that they were a novelty, an exception to the long-standing, exclusive tradition of Pinehurst, and that made Maya's stomach churn. A group of girls near their lockers caught sight of the twins and stopped talking mid-sentence. One whispered to the other, though not quietly enough to avoid Maya and Milan's ears. "The new principal's daughters, huh?" Milan bristled, but Maya gently touched her arm. "Don't engage," she whispered, her voice just above a breath. As they continued through the hallway, Maya kept her head down, the weight of the atmosphere pressing on her chest. They finally reached the administrative office, where Mrs. Evelyn Harper, the school secretary, sat behind a perfectly neat desk, her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun that matched her sharp expression. "We're here for our schedules," Milan said, her voice steady, but the tension in the air was palpable. Mrs. Harper barely acknowledged them, her eyes moving over their faces with a distinct lack of interest. She handed them their schedules without a word, not even offering the barest form of acknowledgement. The coldness in her tone, her failure to make eye contact, stung more than the harsh looks they'd received in the hallway. "Thank you," Maya said quietly, trying to maintain her composure despite the sting of being ignored. The door to the first classroom, history with Mrs. Langley, loomed ahead of them like the entrance to a battlefield. Mrs. Langley had been described as a formidable teacher, one who upheld the school's rigorous academic standards with a stern hand. But the twins were already bracing for more than just an academic challenge. As they entered, Mrs. Langley looked up at them with a cold, calculating expression that made Maya's stomach twist. Her eyes lingered just a moment too long, and then she greeted them with a barely perceptible nod, a nod that spoke volumes in its dismissiveness. The rest of the class, a sea of white faces, glanced at them, and then quickly averted their eyes. Milan nudged her sister with her elbow as they took their seats at the back of the classroom. Maya shot her a look, but it was clear that Milan, too, was feeling the weight of being watched like a specimen under glass. The lesson began as Mrs. Langley lectured about the civil rights movement. Her words were sharp, calculated, as if she were teaching a lesson in history, but not in empathy. When she reached the part about Martin Luther King Jr., she paused for a moment before speaking with a hint of disdain. "Not everyone can be Martin Luther King," she said, her eyes flicking over the twins. "Some people need to know their place." The words were like daggers, cutting through the already tense silence of the classroom. Maya felt the blood drain from her face, but she didn't dare look at her sister, knowing that Milan would be fighting the urge to say something in retaliation. The laughter that followed, soft at first, rippled through the room like a virus, starting from the front row where Jason Whitman, Pinehurst's golden boy, sat. His entitled grin spread across his face as he exchanged looks with his friends, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Milan's grip tightened around her pen, her jaw set, but Maya could feel her sister's anger radiating like heat off a furnace. She wanted to speak, to stand up and shout, to say something, but her father's words rang in her mind. "Choose your battles." As Mrs. Langley moved between the rows of desks, she approached theirs, her eyes lingering over the papers on their desks as if inspecting them, as if measuring them against her own standards. Her voice, when it came, was sharp and cold. "Well, since you're both new here," she said, turning her gaze to Milan, "perhaps you can enlighten us on what your people think about this." The word "people" felt like it dripped from her mouth like poison, making Milan's blood boil. She could see it in her sister's eyes, the storm brewing just beneath the surface, ready to explode. But Milan held her ground, her voice steady, though Maya could hear the slight tremor in her words as she replied, "I think that everyone, no matter their skin color, deserves to be treated equally." Mrs. Langley ignored her, as if Milan's words were nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience. She turned back to the front of the room, dismissing Milan with a wave of her hand as if her existence didn't matter. The classroom erupted in laughter again, louder this time. But for Maya and Milan, it was more than just a humiliating moment. It was the beginning of something much bigger, a storm that was brewing just beneath the surface, waiting for the right spark to ignite it. And that spark was about to come. A moment of truth. The days that followed were like a slow burn, each one feeding into the next with a quiet intensity that only grew stronger as the tension between the twins and their classmates mounted. Maya and Milan tried to keep their heads down, to blend in with the background noise of Pinehurst Academy, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape the whispered comments, the cold stares, and the insidious feeling that they were not meant to be there. It started with the little things. The way the teachers glanced over their hands when they raised them to answer a question, their eyes avoiding the twins' gaze as if they were invisible. How their classmates, those who had once been polite, now avoided speaking to them unless absolutely necessary. The cafeteria became their battleground. While others sat with their friends, laughing and chatting, Maya and Milan were always left alone at their table, their food untouched as the world around them went on without them. But the most painful moments weren't the stares or the whispers. No, The true sting came from Mrs. Langley, who seemed determined to make their lives as difficult as possible. After the incident in the history class, where she had humiliated them in front of the entire room, things had only gotten worse. Mrs. Langley had begun to single them out in every lesson, picking apart their work and dismissing their contributions, all while praising their classmates for the same things. It was as if their very presence was an affront to her carefully constructed world. Milan was always the first to pick up on these slights. Her sharp eyes never missed the way Mrs. Langley would glance at her paper with a thinly veiled sneer before assigning it a grade lower than it deserved. Maya, on the other hand, tried to keep her head down, to quietly absorb the mistreatment without reacting. But even she couldn't ignore how their essays were marked with dismissive red ink, or how their attempts to speak up in class were swiftly cut off by Mrs. Langley's biting comments. By the end of the week, Maya and Milan were worn thin. They'd hoped it would get better with time, that things would settle, and they would eventually be accepted. But they were wrong. The more they tried to stay strong, the more the isolation deepened, like a wound that refused to heal. One afternoon, as they sat in the cafeteria eating in silence, the door opened and a group of girls walked in. They were chatting and laughing, but when they saw Maya and Milan sitting alone, their conversation abruptly died. The girls exchanged glances before one of them, Amanda, made her way over to the twins' table. "Hey, do you guys want to join us?" Amanda asked, her voice tentative, though there was a hint of curiosity in her tone. Maya looked up, her heart lifting slightly at the offer. But Milan, ever the realist, saw right through the gesture. The sympathy in Amanda's eyes was too forced, too rehearsed. "We're fine," Milan replied, her voice flat. "Thanks." The girls hesitated for a moment, exchanging uncomfortable glances before quickly walking away. Maya felt the sting of rejection, but it was a familiar pain by now. The truth was, they weren't welcome. Not really. But it wasn't just the students. It was the teachers, too. They had witnessed the way Mrs. Langley ignored them, how she treated them like they were invisible or worse, like they didn't belong. It was as though they were reminders of a change they weren't ready to face. Later that afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day of lessons, Maya and Milan walked home with their father, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. They had spent the day trying to ignore the hurt, to carry on as if everything was fine, but the weight of it all was crushing. The words Mrs. Langley had said, the ones that had hurt so much, echoed in their minds, haunting them as they walked through the gates of their neighborhood. "I don't know how much longer I can take it," Milan muttered, her voice barely audible. "It's like they want us to fail." Maya stayed quiet, knowing her sister wasn't just talking about the schoolwork. It wasn't just about the grades or the tests. It was about everything that was happening to them, everything they were being forced to endure. When they reached the house, Dr. Johnson was waiting at the door, his eyes scanning their faces for any sign of trouble. He smiled when he saw them, but it quickly faded when he noticed the tightness in their expressions. "How was school today?" he asked softly, his voice laced with concern. "Same as always," Milan said with a sigh. "Nothing's changed." Dr. Johnson didn't push them for details. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing them to pass into the warmth of the house. But as they sat down at the dinner table that night, the silence between them grew heavier. Finally, it was Maya who spoke up. "Dad, it's hard. They're treating us like we don't belong here, like we're some kind of experiment." Dr. Johnson's brow furrowed slightly, but his voice remained calm and steady as he responded. "I know it's hard, girls, and I'm sorry you're feeling this way. But sometimes, when you try to make a difference, you face resistance. What you're experiencing right now is just that. A resistance to change. Pinehurst Academy isn't used to students like you." Milan looked up, meeting her father's gaze with fire in her eyes. "So, what do we do? Just keep quiet and take it. Keep letting them treat us like we're invisible." Dr. Johnson's expression softened, and he placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "No, Milan. You don't have to be quiet, but you have to be strategic. Change doesn't come easily. You've been taught to be strong, but you've also been taught to stand up for what's right. If you feel that what's happening at Pinehurst isn't right, you speak up, but make sure your voice is heard in the right way. Don't let them drag you down to their level. Rise above it. The words felt comforting, but Maya could tell that her father was struggling with the same anger and helplessness that they were. He had worked his whole life to reach the position of principal, to make a real difference in an institution like Pinehurst. And yet, now that he was here, he was facing the full brunt of the resistance his daughters were encountering. The weight of the school's culture, the ingrained bias, seemed insurmountable. It was Milan, always the one to act, who broke the silence next. We're not going to let them break us, right? We'll keep fighting. Maya nodded, feeling a surge of determination. Yeah, we won't back down. As the evening wore on, they ate dinner in near silence, the weight of the day's events still hanging over them, but in the quiet of their home, with their father's presence grounding them. The storm that had been building in their hearts slowly started to calm. That night, as Maya lay in bed, her thoughts raced. She couldn't ignore what had happened to her in Milan, how Mrs. Langley's cruel words had targeted them, how their classmates had either ignored or actively participated in their exclusion. The hurt had settled deep within her, a slow, gnawing ache that wouldn't let go. But there was something else, something bubbling beneath the surface, a feeling of anger, of injustice, that burned hotter than any shame she felt. Maya knew that they couldn't let things continue like this. They couldn't let the weight of Pinehurst's history crush their spirit. And so, when she closed her eyes that night, the vision that filled her mind wasn't one of defeat. It was of something much greater, a plan, a way to fight back, to make their voices heard. But first, they needed a strategy. The fight wasn't over, and it would be a long road ahead. But Maya and Milan were ready to walk it. The first spark. The days following their conversation with their father felt like a turning point, though neither Maya nor Milan was ready to acknowledge it fully. It wasn't that the tension at Pinehurst had lessened. Far from it. But something within them had shifted. There was a quiet fire growing inside them, one that couldn't be extinguished by the passive-aggressive comments of Mrs. Langley or the cold stares from their classmates. It was a fire built on their father's words. Rise above it. The twins had always been close, their bond forged from years of shared experiences, but now they were connected by something more, a sense of purpose, of being more than just students at Pinehurst Academy. They were the embodiment of change, and they knew it. But change, they quickly realized, wasn't something that could be forced overnight. It was slow, deliberate, and required more than just standing up for themselves. It required strategy. It started with small acts, ones that might seem insignificant on the surface, but they were the beginning of a much bigger plan. Milan's first act of defiance happened during their second history class with Mrs. Langley. The class was discussing the abolition of slavery, a topic that always stirred something inside Milan. But today, Mrs. Langley's tone was different, too clinical, too distant. As she discussed the historical facts, it was clear that she had little regard for the emotional weight of the subject. She treated it as just another date to memorize, a chapter in a book. Milan couldn't take it anymore. I don't think this is just history, Milan said, her voice cutting through the monotony of Mrs. Langley's lecture. The room grew silent as all eyes turned to her. This is our history, the history of black people in this country. It's not just dates and names. It's lives, it's pain, it's resistance. The room was still, the other students watching as Mrs. Langley's jaw tightened, the faintest glimmer of irritation crossing her face. She opened her mouth to say something, but Milan held her gaze, unflinching. Milan, we're here to discuss facts, Mrs. Langley finally said, her tone clipped. Not emotions. Milan's eyes narrowed. Facts are important, but feeling what those facts mean is just as important. For a moment, Mrs. Langley stood there, her eyes locked on Milan, and Maya could see the brief flicker of surprise in her teacher's expression. No one had ever dared to challenge her in class like that, especially not a student who was clearly not fitting in. But Milan didn't back down. She leaned forward, her voice steady, but firm. "I know what it's like to be dismissed," she said, her words almost a whisper but so full of conviction that everyone heard them. "And I'm not going to let that happen anymore." The bell rang shortly after, signaling the end of class. Maya and Milan gathered their things in silence, the weight of Milan's words hanging in the air. As they walked out of the room, they exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes. They weren't just going to stand by anymore. They weren't going to be invisible. It was the first spark, the first moment when they began to understand that their voices had power. The next day, the twins went about their usual routine, but everything felt different. There was a new energy between them, a shared determination that burned bright despite the challenges they faced. The hallways no longer felt like a battlefield. They were just another space to navigate on their way to something bigger. But even as their resolve grew stronger, the weight of the school's culture remained heavy on their shoulders. They couldn't escape the glares and whispers of their peers, the way they were continually isolated. And they certainly couldn't ignore the way Mrs. Langley continued to dismiss them. The tipping point came during lunch that day. The cafeteria was as loud and chaotic as always, with students gossiping, laughing, and eating in their cliques. But for Maya and Milan, it was a familiar, uncomfortable silence. They sat at their usual table, their trays untouched, as always. It wasn't just the isolation that stung. It was the feeling that they didn't belong, that their mere presence was an intrusion on a world that wasn't made for them. But this time, it was different. Milan wasn't content to sit in silence anymore. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The noise in the cafeteria briefly quieted, heads turning to look at her. She scanned the room, taking in the faces of students who either avoided eye contact or watched with an air of judgment. Without saying a word, she walked over to a group of girls sitting near the center of the room. These were the same girls who had whispered behind their backs just days ago, who had mocked their hair and clothes, who had laughed when they had tried to sit at the same table. Milan stood in front of their table, her posture unyielding. The girls stopped mid-conversation, exchanging surprised glances. "I don't need your approval," Milan said, her voice firm and loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I want you to know that we're here to stay. And if you have a problem with that, it's yours, not ours." The room fell silent. The girls exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure how to respond. Milan didn't wait for them to speak. She turned on her heel and walked back to her sister's side, sitting down without a word. Maya's heart was racing. The shock of Milan's sudden confrontation sent waves through her. But at the same time, there was something thrilling about it. Something empowering. That was the moment Maya realized. They weren't just fighting to fit in anymore. They were fighting to be heard, to be seen, and to be respected. Over the next few days, the word began to spread. It wasn't just their classmates who had taken notice of Milan's outburst. It was the faculty, too. Teachers whispered in the hallways, some shocked, some uncomfortable, and some, like Mrs. Harper in the office, worried about what this meant for the school's reputation. But no one spoke up. No one intervened. Maya and Milan kept their heads down, focusing on their schoolwork while quietly observing the dynamics around them. They could feel the tension rising, the subtle changes in how people looked at them, how the whispers were getting louder and more pointed. Then, during a particularly tense history class, Mrs. Langley made her move. She handed out their essays from the week before, but when she reached Milan's paper, she paused. The room seemed to hold its breath as Mrs. Langley looked down at the paper with a sneer. She placed it on Milan's desk, her eyes flicking to the rest of the class. "Not everyone is meant for academic excellence," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some of us are just better suited to, well, other things." The classroom erupted in quiet snickers, but Maya's eyes locked on Milan. Her sister's face was flushed, her hands trembling with barely contained rage. But this time, something was different. Milan didn't stay quiet. She didn't shrink into herself. "Excuse me, Mrs. Langley," Milan asked, her voice calm, but steely. The teacher's head snapped up, surprised by the challenge. "I've earned every grade I've gotten," Milan continued, her gaze unwavering. "You don't get to decide what I'm capable of based on what I look like." The class fell silent, the tension so thick it felt like the air was suffocating. Mrs. Langley's lips tightened, her eyes narrowing, but she said nothing. She simply turned back to the front of the class and continued the lesson, her voice trembling slightly. Maya and Milan exchanged a look. This wasn't just a fight for respect. It was a fight for their right to be seen as equals. They were done playing by the rules set for them. It was time to set their own. The spark had ignited, and this time there would be no turning back. The turning tide. The days after their confrontation with Mrs. Langley felt like an unspoken declaration of war, though neither Maya nor Milan had explicitly acknowledged it. The weight of the quiet stares, the whispers, and the escalating tension seemed to have reached a tipping point. Pinehurst Academy, which had once felt like an intimidating, sterile fortress, now seemed like an environment that was barely holding itself together. Though the twins had already started standing their ground, what had followed their explosive moments in class and the cafeteria was an undeniable shift. It wasn't just about the isolation anymore. It wasn't just about them. It was about everyone. Change was coming, and they could feel it. But as they quickly discovered, it would be no easy fight. At first, the shift was subtle. The group of girls who had previously mocked them in the cafeteria, the ones who had laughed at their clothes and their mannerisms, had become more cautious around the twins. They didn't stop talking, but their voices had lowered when they mentioned the Johnson sisters. The small glances, the sidelong stares, and the sudden silences when they entered a room, though uncomfortable, weren't as mocking as before. It wasn't warmth, but it was progress. And then there were the teachers. They didn't act overtly hostile, but Maya and Milan could feel the subtle difference in the way they treated them. The dismissive grades, the lack of engagement in class discussions, all of it began to feel more like a pressure cooker slowly building toward an explosion. Mrs. Langley, in particular, became more vindictive. Her coldness wasn't just apparent in how she marked their papers. It was in her every glance, in the subtle snubs during lessons, in the way she deliberately ignored their contributions. One afternoon, as the twins sat in their history class, it was clear something was different. Mrs. Langley had just finished distributing graded essays, and the usual awkward silence descended as the students flipped their papers over to check their marks. But this time, something in the way Mrs. Langley moved, something in the stillness of the room, felt off. Milan could feel it first, the tension hanging in the air like a heavy mist. She hadn't been this on edge since the first day of school. When Mrs. Langley approached their desks, her hands held their papers tightly, her expression unreadable. "This is a reflection of the work you're producing," Mrs. Langley said, her voice barely concealing a note of disdain as she handed Milan her essay. "You need to do better, Milan. It's clear you're not pushing yourself enough." Milan took the paper from her, and as soon as her eyes scanned the grade, a D, her heart dropped. She had worked so hard on this essay, pored over every detail, every citation, ensuring her arguments were clear and well supported. A D. She looked up at Mrs. Langley, who was staring down at her, waiting for a response. But Milan didn't say anything. The anger that had been building inside her for weeks now surged to the surface, but she refused to let it boil over. She wouldn't give Mrs. Langley the satisfaction. Instead, she met her teacher's gaze, unflinching. "You're wrong," Milan said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "This grade isn't a reflection of my effort or my abilities. It's a reflection of your bias." The entire classroom went dead silent. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced at her sister. Milan was standing her ground, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Langley's. Mrs. Langley's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I don't appreciate being spoken to that way," she said, her voice icy. "But I'll let it slide this time." But Milan wasn't finished. "No," she said, her voice rising just slightly. "It's not a this time thing. You've been dismissing me and Maya since we got here. You've been dismissing us because we're different." Mrs. Langley's gaze flicked around the room, and the other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. There was a subtle tension that rippled through the air, the realization sinking in that the twins weren't just sitting silently anymore. "You think we don't belong here," Milan continued, her voice steady despite the thundering of her pulse in her ears. "You think we're somehow less than you. But we're not. We belong here just as much as anyone else. Maybe more." There was a pause, a moment of pure silence that felt like it lasted an eternity. Mrs. Langley opened her mouth, but before she could respond, the door to the classroom swung open, and Principal Johnson, Dr. Jordan Johnson, stepped inside. "Good afternoon, class," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. His eyes flicked from Milan, who was still standing by her desk, to Mrs. Langley, who was now visibly flustered. "I just wanted to drop in and see how things were going." The students, who had been holding their breath for the exchange, relaxed slightly. Maya could feel the shift in the room's energy as Dr. Johnson's presence seemed to wash away the tension. But Milan didn't sit down. She wasn't finished. "Dad," she said, her voice steady, but with an edge of defiance that startled even herself. "This isn't just about an essay. It's about how we've been treated since the moment we set foot in this school. It's about how teachers like Mrs. Langley have treated us, how we've been dismissed, ignored, and humiliated. This grade, this treatment, it's not fair." Dr. Johnson's gaze shifted from Milan to Mrs. Langley. His calm demeanor never wavered, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in his eyes. "I see," he said, his voice quiet but authoritative. "I think we need to have a conversation about this after class." Mrs. Langley, for the first time, looked unsure of herself. She opened her mouth, but Dr. Johnson didn't give her a chance to speak. "Class is over for today," he said, his voice final, the tone brokering no argument. "Milan, Maya, I'll meet you outside." The bell rang, and students quickly gathered their things, shooting glances at the Johnson sisters, who stood their ground. No one spoke, but it was clear that a new chapter had begun. Outside, Maya and Milan met their father by the lockers, their hearts still racing from the exchange. Dr. Johnson looked at them both, his expression unreadable. "You did the right thing," he said quietly, though there was a weight to his words. "But this isn't over." Milan nodded. "We're not going to let them keep pushing us down. We've had enough." Dr. Johnson placed a hand on each of their shoulders, his gaze intense. "It's important to stand your ground, but we need to do it the right way. We can't just lash out. We have to make our voices heard in a way that forces people to listen, not just ignore us. The battle isn't just with your teacher, it's with the whole system." Maya felt her stomach tighten. She understood what her father meant. This wasn't just about one teacher or one class. It was about changing the entire culture of Pinehurst Academy. And that was going to take more than just courage. It was going to take strategy. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the conversation turned serious. "Dad," Maya said, her voice softer than before, "what if we can't change things here? What if the people who run this place just refuse to see us? What if they don't care about what's right?" Dr. Johnson paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, before setting it down. "Then we keep pushing. We never stop fighting for what's right. Change might not come quickly, but every step we take, no matter how small, is a step closer to where we need to be." Milan met her father's gaze, her eyes fierce. "We're not backing down, Dad. We'll make them see us. We'll make them listen." For the first time in weeks, the weight of the world didn't seem quite so heavy. They were on the path to something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored any longer. The fight for their place in Pinehurst had only just begun. The reckoning. The following days were a whirlwind of whispers, glances, and tension-filled classrooms. The classroom walls at Pinehurst Academy had always been silent observers of the school's strict traditions. Now those walls seemed to echo with the quiet murmurs of change. Change that was being led by two black girls who refused to back down. After their stand with Mrs. Langley, the twins, Maya and Milan, felt something shift. There was no grand victory, no immediate applause, but the tension was undeniable. More students began to look at them differently, some with respect, others with curiosity, and still others with confusion. They were breaking an unspoken rule, standing up, speaking out, and demanding equality. It was becoming clear that their actions weren't just making waves among students. They were slowly beginning to ripple through the faculty, too. Dr. Johnson, their father, had walked them through a long, difficult discussion about how to handle the aftermath of their confrontation. His voice had remained calm, but Maya could hear the quiet anger just beneath the surface. The stakes had risen, and he was determined to stand behind his daughters, no matter the cost. "I need you to remember something," he told them one evening. "This isn't just about standing up in class or calling out the injustice. This is about making the people who are in positions of power feel what you've been through. Make them see it, but do it in a way that shakes them to their core, something they can't just ignore or dismiss." Maya had nodded, her stomach twisted in knots. She didn't fully understand how they would go about doing that, but she trusted her father. Milan, always the bolder one, had squeezed Maya's hand, her eyes gleaming with resolve. "I'm ready," she'd whispered. "Let's make them pay attention." The twins weren't sure when it had started to feel like a battle, but it did. Every hallway they walked down, every classroom they entered, felt like an arena. But now, instead of cowering from the stares or the whispers, they stood tall, side by side. They were becoming a force, even if the world hadn't quite realized it yet. Then, on a chilly Friday afternoon, the storm finally broke. It had started like any other day. The hallways of Pinehurst Academy were bustling with students, the low murmur of chatter echoing through the school. Maya and Milan had just finished lunch and were walking to their next class when they noticed the group of teachers gathered in the corner of the hallway. Mrs. Langley was standing among them, her posture stiff as always. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the twins walk by. Maya's heart skipped a beat when she noticed the other teachers' eyes following her and Milan. They were no longer just passive bystanders to the tension. Now, they were watching. It was then that Maya noticed something else. The principal's office door was open, and through the crack, she could see Dr. Johnson standing inside, speaking with a few of the senior board members. He looked focused as always, but there was something different in his posture. It was as though a change was imminent, a moment when the carefully constructed world of Pinehurst Academy was about to crack wide open. Maya glanced at Milan, whose gaze was fixed ahead. She could tell that her sister had noticed it too, the growing sense that things had escalated beyond what they'd anticipated. They had their next class to focus on, but it was hard to concentrate. Every time Mrs. Langley passed by, Maya could feel her eyes on them. Her presence was like a looming shadow in every classroom, in every hallway. By the time the bell rang at the end of the day, it was clear that something big was coming. The students had begun to talk, but they weren't talking about tests or upcoming projects. They were whispering about the Johnson twins and their confrontation in history class. They were discussing the rumors of a meeting taking place that very evening, the first real chance for their father, Dr. Jordan Johnson, to stand his ground in front of the board. Maya and Milan found themselves in the back seat of their father's car that evening, staring out of the window as the world outside seemed to shift with uncertainty. They had been to meetings before, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with the unspoken tension of what might happen next. When they arrived at Pinehurst Academy, the parking lot was filled with cars they didn't recognize. Teachers, parents, board members. The campus, usually so peaceful, was now buzzing with an intensity that felt like it could spill over at any moment. Inside, the gymnasium was packed with people, their faces anxious, their conversations loud but hushed. The long rows of folding chairs were filled with parents, students, teachers, and community members, all here for the emergency school board meeting. At the front of the room, a long table was set up with several board members seated at it. The head of the board, William Barrett, was in the center, his face grim and serious. Dr. Johnson walked into the room, his presence commanding attention. He was calm, but there was a weight to him tonight, an almost unshakable determination. Maya and Milan walked beside him, their heads held high as they took their seats in the front row. They could feel the weight of the eyes on them, but they didn't let it break their stride. The meeting began, and William Barrett stood up, adjusting his tie before addressing the room. "We've gathered here tonight to discuss recent developments within Pinehurst Academy," he said, his voice firm and authoritative. "Specifically, we need to address the leadership of Dr. Jordan Johnson and his approach to what he calls diversity initiatives." Maya's heart clenched. She could already hear where this was headed. "We've received numerous complaints from faculty members, parents, and alumni about the disruptive nature of these initiatives," Barrett continued. "There is growing concern that these actions are creating division rather than unity." Milan shot a quick glance at Maya, her lips pressed into a thin line. The board members were talking about their father like he was a problem to be fixed, not a leader trying to change a broken system. "We've heard from people who believe Dr. Johnson is pushing an agenda that threatens the values this school has upheld for generations," Barrett said, his voice full of quiet condemnation. "Tonight, we will vote on whether or not he should remain in his position as principal." There was a pause, and the room went deathly silent. Maya's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to stand up and shout that it wasn't just about her father. It was about them, her and Milan, and every student who had ever been silenced by the weight of the system. But instead of speaking out in anger, Dr. Johnson remained still, his face stoic. He stood up slowly, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I came to Pinehurst Academy not to destroy tradition," he began, his voice carrying across the room, "but to help it evolve. We are living in a time where we can no longer ignore the injustices that have existed within our walls. Pinehurst is meant to be a place of education, a place where every student is given the opportunity to thrive. But some students are being left behind. Some students, like my daughters, are being treated as less than." The room grew quieter as Dr. Johnson's words landed, cutting through the tension like a knife. Maya and Milan exchanged a look, the weight of their father's statements settling over them. They've been dismissed, ignored, and treated unfairly by people who think that their differences make them inferior, Dr. Johnson continued, his voice steady but fierce. "I won't allow that to continue. Not for my daughters. Not for any student here." For a moment, there was silence. A hush fell over the room, as the board members in the audience absorbed his words. And then, as if on cue, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "I second that," came the unmistakable voice of Mrs. Langley. The room erupted in surprise. Heads whipped toward the back of the room, where Mrs. Langley stood, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "I have watched over the past few days as Dr. Johnson's daughters have fought for their place in this school," Mrs. Langley said, her voice quieter now, but full of sincerity. "And I have realized something important, something I had missed. They deserve better. We all deserve better." Maya's breath caught in her throat. It was unexpected, shocking even. Mrs. Langley, the very teacher who had belittled them in class, was speaking out in their favor. The board members exchanged uncertain glances. They hadn't expected this kind of support. As the meeting continued, the tension in the room shifted. It wasn't just about Dr. Johnson anymore. It wasn't just about the politics of Pinehurst Academy. It was about the truth, about the pain that students like Maya and Milan had endured for years without a voice, without anyone willing to listen. And that truth was finally being heard. When the meeting adjourned, Dr. Johnson stood tall, his eyes meeting his daughters as they left the room. They hadn't won yet, but they were closer than they had ever been. The battle was far from over, but they had made their voices heard. And no one, not even the powerful people sitting in that room, could ignore them any longer. The reckoning had begun. The final blow. The days following the emergency school board meeting felt like a blur, as if everything was moving at a faster pace than they could keep up with. Pinehurst Academy was on the brink of something monumental, and the Johnson sisters, Maya and Milan, were at the center of it. Their battle had started quietly, almost imperceptibly, but now it was a storm that couldn't be contained. The ripple effects of their courage had spread throughout the school, touching every student, teacher, and parent, and forcing Pinehurst to confront the uncomfortable truths it had long buried. But as the truth started to emerge, so did the resistance. The wealthy parents who held the strings of Pinehurst's elite status were not going to let things change without a fight. The very power structures that had kept the status quo intact were now pushing back harder than ever before. Pinehurst was a fortress of privilege, and in their eyes, Dr. Jordan Johnson and his daughters, Maya and Milan, were threatening the foundation it was built on. The pressure mounted. The whispers grew louder, and the divisions between the students, faculty, and board members deepened. It was a battle that would take more than just words. It would take action. And it was time for Maya and Milan to make the most important choice of their lives. The morning of the board's final vote arrived, and the air at Pinehurst Academy felt thick with anticipation. The students buzzed in the hallways, their faces a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. Everyone knew that today would determine the future of their school, whether it would remain locked in the past or evolve into something more just and inclusive. It was a historic day, and Maya and Milan were determined to make sure it was a day they would never forget. As they entered the school, Maya's heart raced. The hallways were eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the usual buzz of student chatter. But there was an undercurrent of energy that could not be ignored. Teachers and students alike had taken sides, and everyone was waiting for the outcome of the vote. But Maya wasn't thinking about the vote. She was thinking about the lives that had been affected by the culture of exclusion at Pinehurst, about the students who had felt invisible for years, just like she and Milan had. "Are you ready?" Milan's voice broke through Maya's thoughts. She was standing next to her, her eyes determined and fierce, the same fire that had ignited in her at the moment they stepped onto this battleground still burning brightly. "I am," Maya replied, though her voice was tight with emotion. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." The twins walked into the gymnasium, their father's steady presence beside them. The space was packed with people, parents, teachers, community members, everyone waiting to hear the outcome. At the front of the room, the board members were seated, their faces unreadable as they shuffled papers and exchanged quiet words. Dr. Johnson was calm, his posture straight and dignified, but Maya could sense the tension in him. He was ready to fight. For his daughters, for the students who had never had a voice, for the changes that needed to happen. The board meeting began, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for gathering," William Barrett, the board chairman, said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "We are here today to vote on the future of Pinehurst Academy, and specifically, the leadership of Dr. Jordan Johnson. The proposal on the table is whether or not he should remain as principal, given the recent developments surrounding his diversity initiatives and the changes he has implemented." There was a murmur in the room, a ripple of anticipation that ran through the crowd. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she watched her father stand tall, his eyes unwavering. "We've heard arguments from both sides," Barrett continued. "And now it is time for us to cast our votes. Let us proceed." The first board member to vote was Sarah Mitchell, a longtime supporter of the Academy's old ways. She spoke in favor of Dr. Johnson's removal, her words sharp and precise. "I believe Dr. Johnson's approach is too radical for Pinehurst," she said, her tone laced with a clear sense of superiority. "This school has always been built on tradition and excellence, and we cannot allow his agenda to disrupt that." The room went quiet. Some heads nodded in agreement, but others, teachers, parents, shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Johnson's expression remained calm, but Maya could feel the tension mounting around them. The next board member, Thomas Green, voted similarly, citing concerns over how the diversity programs had made some students and families uncomfortable. He also raised concerns about how Dr. Johnson's leadership had caused friction among faculty. But then, a surprising voice spoke up. "I disagree," said Charles Morton, the judge who had previously been a quiet participant in the meetings. He stood up, his voice loud and clear, cutting through the heavy air. "This school has prided itself on excellence for years, but what about the excellence of its students? What about the students who are not given the opportunity to succeed because of prejudice and bias?" Maya's heart skipped a beat. This was the voice they had been waiting for. "We cannot continue to ignore the inequalities that exist within these walls," Morton continued. "Dr. Johnson is right to push for change. We need a school that embraces diversity, that allows every student to thrive. I vote to retain Dr. Johnson as principal." A gasp rippled through the room, and Maya saw several parents exchange glances. The tide was turning, and there was no going back now. One by one, the board members cast their votes. Some voted to remove Dr. Johnson, but more and more were speaking out in his favor. And then, at last, it came time for the final vote. Barrett looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the board members before he made his decision. "I vote to remove Dr. Johnson," he said, his voice heavy with finality. The room went silent. The air felt thick, like the whole world was holding its breath. But then, a voice broke the silence. "I move to reconsider," came the voice of Mrs. Langley, who stood at the back of the room, her eyes narrowed in quiet defiance. "Dr. Johnson is not the problem. The problem is that we have failed to listen to the needs of all our students. We failed to see what's been happening right under our noses." Maya's heart raced as she turned to Milan, her sister's eyes wide with surprise. Mrs. Langley, the very teacher who had once belittled them, was now standing up for them, for the change they had fought so hard to achieve. "I second that motion," came another voice, this one from Mr. Peterson, a teacher who had quietly observed the treatment of the twins in class, but had never spoken up until now. A wave of realization swept through the room. The momentum had shifted. What had started as a confrontation in a classroom had now grown into a movement, one that couldn't be stopped. The final votes were cast, and the results were clear. Dr. Jordan Johnson would remain as the principal of Pinehurst Academy. The room erupted in a mix of applause and protests. Parents who had supported Dr. Johnson's removal were stunned, but they were outnumbered. For the first time, Pinehurst Academy was on the brink of something new. The tide had turned, and the battle was far from over, but the Johnson family had won a crucial victory. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Johnson stood up, his expression a mixture of relief and pride. He turned to Maya and Milan, his eyes softening as he placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Milan, who had fought so fiercely, let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "We're not done yet, Dad," she said with a fierce grin. "But it's a start." Maya smiled, her heart full. "It's a big start." As they walked out of the gymnasium, their father by their side, Maya and Milan felt the weight of the victory settle in. They had faced the hardest challenge of their lives, and though there was still much to be done, they knew that this moment, this victory, would change Pinehurst Academy forever. And more importantly, it would change them. They weren't just two black girls at Pinehurst Academy anymore. They were symbols of change, and their fight, their voice, would never be silenced again.